Good morning, everybody. My name is Helen Partridge, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Teaching and Learning here at Deakin University. And it is my absolute honour and pleasure to welcome you to this year's CRADLE Symposium. As we gather for this event, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place. And doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. This year's theme is Assessment for Inclusion. The symposium brings together researchers in the fields of higher education assessment, inclusion and social justice to share ideas, research and practice, and problematise the concept of inclusive assessment. The symposium aims to take stock of what has already been done, both practically and conceptually, identify areas of synergy for collaboration, and develop a research agenda, which serves to improve the equity of assessment in higher education. From this year's symposium, CRADLE will produce an edited book, their fourth, on assessment for inclusion. I'm confident you're going to enjoy this year's CRADLE Symposium. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rolla to introduce you to today's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the lands on which we meet. I'm on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you, Helen, so much for opening our symposium. My name is Rolla Jowie. I'm an Associate Professor at CRADLE, and it's my pleasure alongside Dr. Joanna Tai to co-chair this year's International Symposium. And it's even more my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, who I've been have been reading her work and following her work for a while. Before I do that, though, I do have some housekeeping. So some of you are in the chat already. It's great to see. Please get in there, say hello, where you're from. This symposium is being recorded. We're in webinar format, so that means that we won't be able to see you. We won't be able to see your video. Of course, that's the doorbell, just as that'll stop any minute now. There we go. We won't be able to see you or hear you, but please use the chat during the day as this symposium continues, as the webinar continues. We are recording, as I said already, and please use the Q&A function for any questions. We'll be keeping track of that, and also get on Twitter and share your ideas there. We'll also be recording some blogs, and we'll have this up on the CRADLE website soon. I think that's all I had for housekeeping. So without further ado, I will introduce Professor Penny Jane Burke, who is the Global Innovation Chair of Equity and Director of the Centre of Excellence in Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She's dedicated her work to developing methodological, theoretical and pedagogical frameworks around critical and feminist praxis about time and space in order to reframe equity in higher education. She's published widely, and she's the co-editor of the Bloomsbury Gender and Education book series, the Global Chair of Social Innovation at University of Bath, and an Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter. She's an expert member of the Australian Government's Equity in Higher Education panel as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome Penny to the stage, the metaphorical stage, to talk about inclusive assessment, recognising difference through communities of practice. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, Rolla. And it is a real delight to be here with you all for this opening of the symposium week. Thank you so much to the CRADLE team for making the symposium possible, and also for your kind invitation to contribute to it through this keynote. It's a real honor to be part of these discussions, and it's such a crucial time to be thinking about what it actually means to develop inclusive assessment. I'd like to begin by acknowledging as well the traditional custodians of the different lands upon which we are meeting, for those of us connecting in from Australia, and to acknowledge the Awabakal people whose country I'm speaking from, and to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In relation to this and the concern to develop inclusive assessment, I argue we must pay analytical attention to the histories in which the knowledges of Indigenous peoples have been excluded from higher education, and to acknowledge that these histories continue to have significance for our contemporary practices. Assessment is deeply entangled in these and other interconnected histories of inequality. These historical and often insidious inequalities and exclusions continue to shape the processes by which knowledge and knowing is institutionally validated through assessment frameworks in higher education. And this affects all of us because it shapes the discourses that construct how we understand the purpose of higher education, the knowledge that is seen to be of value, and who is recognized as having the right to higher education, in what ways, and in what contexts. Throughout, I will argue that time and space are crucial to the ways we think about inclusion and assessment, and I will draw from Barbara Adams' concept of timescapes to do this work. These ideas have been at the heart of my work since I myself accessed higher education by a non-traditional pathway, and I also experienced a sense of not belonging, not being the right kind of person, and not having the right kinds of knowledge. These feelings were reinforced by the assessment practices that I and my peers had to decipher and navigate. This was a long time ago now. I'm talking almost 30 years ago. But many of the issues we faced then are enduring ones. The ways practices of assessment are highly coded and sometimes inaccessible, particularly to students who are from underrepresented communities. My early experiences of higher education developed into a body of work that has highlighted the more insidious forms of inequality, those formed through the interconnected, multidimensional injustices of maldistribution, misrecognition, and misrepresentation, drawing from the body of Nancy Fraser's work. And I have argued in my work that these injustices are deeply tied in with the effective, emotional, lived, and embodied experiences of navigating inequalities in, through, and beyond higher education. Assessment is key to this. It is not only about the criteria, the methods, or the grading systems. It is also about how we make sense of potential, capability, and belonging, and other related concepts as assessors and as the assessed, and how that becomes part of our subjective relationship to higher education, to knowledge, and to knowing. Because assessment is entrenched in many of the institutionalized judgments we encounter as knowers and as learners, even when this is an experience of exclusion, it is embodied in our sense of self. And of course, we, and the we I'm referring to now is all of us in this Zoom webinar now, we are all subjected to the technologies of assessment in higher education. So for example, through performance review processes, through peer review practices, and through our power and participation in assessment practices. And so developing a strong reflexivity about how we experience this and enact it might help us to reform our assessment practices, especially when we are engaged with making judgments of others. Assessment is inevitably tied to the contemporary timescapes of higher education, which are increasingly shaped by marketization, corporatization, and commercialization. This, I suggest, has significant implications for the ways we have come to understand what and who higher education is for, with profound impact on assessment practices. This also relates to intersecting political forces, which both explicitly and implicitly shape the terrain in which we develop, produce, and experience assessment. As we argue in changing pedagogical spaces, these include the intersectional political forces of neoliberalism, neocolonialism, and neopatriarchies, as well as many other political forces at play. Without the tools of analysis of the impact of these forces at the macro and meso levels, it is hard to account for the micro level of embodied identity and experience, And without this attention to the relationship across the personal, structural, and social, we fall into a largely individualistic understanding of assessment and related deficit notions of potential capability and success. What is often absent are explicit discussions about how these contemporary discourses of the purpose of higher education and political forces are situated in historical struggles over the right to higher education, who is seen to belong, who has the authority to know, and also to be a knowledge producer. I draw on Foucauldian concepts of discourse to think about how the meanings we take for granted, for example, around potential capability and success, generate knowledge power about and in higher education that are so immersed in our assumptions and our understandings that these become, in Foucault's terms, regimes of truth. These regimes of truth powerfully shape and limit our pedagogical imaginations. When I use the concept pedagogy, I'm drawing on it in its broadest sense, and I see it as encompassing the interrelationship across and between teaching, learning, curriculum, and assessment, the formal spaces in which we engage with these pedagogical dimensions, but also the informal spaces, which I think are of equal importance. Pedagogical spaces generate the meanings we give to ourselves, our subjects, fields, or disciplines, and our broader contexts, and the meanings that are formed through our relational being. Different pedagogical spaces are powerful in reinforcing shared assumptions, shared values, and beliefs. For example, of what we think counts as potential capability and success, and how we might make judgments about that. However, collectively, we can also transform these spaces to generate new timescapes for praxis and to embed this into our ways of doing, creating some conceptual tools and praxis-oriented resources to enable this process was the aim when Jill Crozier and I developed Teaching Inclusively. The Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, CEHE, continues to build on this work, aiming to provide collaborative spaces for praxis, offering conceptual tools for those outside of the social sciences to grapple with key pedagogical concepts in, with, and for their practices, but preferably to do this in collaboration. EquityHE.com offers further praxis-based materials for these kinds of approaches, and this is continuously being developed further by CEHE and our partners and collaborators. Increasingly, particular discourses of what and who higher education is for have become intensified. So, for example, through the discourses of job readiness and employability. And so this symposium comes at a crucial time for challenging thinking about the purpose or the purposes of assessment. I want to communicate the urgency of generating counter-hegemonic timescapes that enable us to engage in social justice praxis as part of a collaborative project of developing what we might call inclusive assessment. I argue that such timescapes will enable us to think and act within an ethics of care and responsibility, to stay with the trouble with reference to Donna Haraway's important thinking, and to grapple with the often problematic and taken for granted meanings that circulate around words, such as inclusive. Drawing then from Barbara Adam, I use the concept of timescapes to extend the notion of the landscape of higher education and to foreground the temporal and spatial dimensions of developing social justice in higher education. The discourses, practices, and relations by which time and space are unequally structured, managed, and negotiated become more visible through the lens of timescapes, I argue. This is crucial as temporal inequalities play out in and through everyday experiences and practices, but are reduced to notions of effective time management skills. Thus, the articulation of experiences of time tend to be limited by discourses of individualism and management, constructed as mechanistic and technocratic. whereby simply providing staff and students with the training to develop the skills to effectively manage their time is identified as a central focus of equity and inclusion. This reinforces deficit discourses of the problem, I argue, which is seen to be simply fixed by better time management skills or the problematic idea of so-called teaching smarter, or even by replacing human pedagogical contributions with technological ones. This erases from view that the problem of inclusion is systematic and also cultural. It is ultimately about the funding and resourcing of higher education, as well as the underpinning values that shape what is seen to matter. This also renders invisible the ways that social, material, cultural, political, and symbolic inequalities are profoundly shaped by, within, and through timescapes, the ways that our identities and practices are formed in and through time and space. It reinforces neoliberal frameworks of assessment by individualizing the problem and ignoring the temporal inequities that students negotiate as they grapple with assessment. It bolts on major transformative projects like indigenizing or decolonizing the curriculum through simply adding in some diverse bodies of material or people without paying attention to the underlying institutionalized racisms that are embedded in the curriculum and the ontological and epistemological framings of these. In the body of my work and through the development of the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, what we call CEHE for short, I have foregrounded praxis as a key element of building what I call transformative equity, which is underpinned by social justice theories practices. A praxis-based framework for equity explicitly brings together theory and practice in dialogical connection, creating new relationalities to time and space, for reflection, action, action, reflection. It is a way of interrogating taken for granted values, assumptions, and perspectives that are embedded in institutionalized histories of exclusion to generate new forms of research-informed practice and practice-informed research. It is a way of disrupting deficit models that reproduce impoverished notions of inclusion and diversity, and that locate the problem of equity in the supposed deficiencies of the individual. I have argued that such deficit models lean heavily into problematic and decontextualized forms of student support based on remediation, rather than to tackle the complex dynamics of power and knowledge in the formation of studenthood, the recognition of capability that is central to a sense of belonging in higher education, and for which assessment plays a major role. It is through praxis-oriented approaches that we are able to grapple with these complexities and move away from simplistic and harmful deficit models of equity to more transformative social justice ones. So what do I mean by an impoverished view of inclusion? My body of research has demonstrated that inclusion often operates as a form of symbolic violence, a way of regulating difference and making difference as other, as a problem to be fixed. That is, inclusion becomes an institutional mechanism to transform students seen as other or different to fit into the dominant values, practices, and ways of being in order that they are recognizable as capable university students. Assessment is a technology, and I use technology here in a Foucauldian sense of the word, that reinforces such forms of symbolic violence, a technology that excludes those who are misrecognized as incapable of meeting the criteria, which is designed to aid assessors to rank, grade, hierarchize, and measure the assessed. The assessment criteria are presented as neutral and transparent tools for the assessor to make fair judgments, rather than as embedded in the particular shared values, assumptions, and perspectives of the communities of practice in which the assessment has been designed and conducted. Communities of practice, drawing here from Lav and Wenger's body of work, and of course many others who've engaged with it. So communities of practice are significant spaces in which our academic, discipline-based, and professional knowledge is legitimated and developed. But inclusion in the community of practice emphasizes that which is shared, rather than grappling with ontological differences and epistemological contestations that generate sometimes exclusions and a sense of not belonging. In the context of contemporary higher education temporalities, including the intensified pace of work, knowledge production, and assessment experienced by both staff and students, there is little time space to interrogate our taken for granted assumptions, values, and perspectives through forms of what I call ethical reflexivity. I offer the concept ethical reflexivity to signal an ongoing commitment to examining one's situatedness in complex relations of power, and to critically consider the values, assumptions, and perspectives that shape key higher education discourses and practices, including of assessment. This involves a deep and sustained orientation to praxis. Although communities of practice are important sites in which academic, disciplinary, and professional knowledge is shared, formed, and developed, the implicit sense of knowing of the collective body often undermines the capacity to exercise ethical reflexivity about how these ontological and epistemological framings might be experienced as exclusive to other bodies of knowledge and people. An example is that we often attempt to decolonize the curriculum without attention to the Western and white-centric epistemologies that frame the discipline. We often aim to create inclusive practices whilst requiring students from diverse communities to conform to the implicit values embedded institutionally without explicit attention to the different values at play that relate to the diverse experiences and communities that student identities are situated in. Examples might include an emphasis on measurement, which tends to exclude articulations of experiences that are not measurable, an emphasis on objectivity that excludes the expression of subjective forms of knowing, and an emphasis on job readiness, which undermines orientations towards studying for the love of learning, or concerns with social and environmental justice, or simply building capacity to make a difference to one's wider communities. Assessment practices are, of course, embedded in the communities of practice. So what I mean by that, math, psychology, sociology, science, these communities of practice in which our mutual knowledge provides important epistemic foundations and developments, providing significant and meaningful spaces of shared understanding, belonging, and identity. This can afford opportunities towards developing forms of inclusive assessment. However, communities of practice also produce significant forms of exclusion and misrecognition, often realized explicitly through assessment practices, undermining students' sense of capability, success, identity, and belonging. The tendency to misrepresent assessment as neutral, fair, and value-free leads to the reproduction of inequalities through the erasure of the implicit knowledge, values, and perspectives that frame it. There is thus a circularity of the legitimization of the knowledge, values, and perspectives of those who are included in the community of practice and are in a position to determine the assessment framework in the first place. These exclusionary assessment practices are entangled in relations of inequality in ways that are often invisible, particularly in the absence of close analysis and ethical reflexivity. Social justice theories provide important analytical and reflexive tools to bring to light the exclusionary dimensions of assessment practice, otherwise unseen. Furthermore, moving away from theory and practice as separate entities and towards praxis, enabling new dialogical spaces of critical reflection action reflection to support the development of social justice-oriented forms of inclusive assessment. So my research with Jackie McManus, Art for a Few, provides a really compelling case to bring such exclusionary processes to light. As part of this research, we observed 70 selection interviews across 5 UK higher education institutions, which consisted of multi-steps in the selection process. So as well as the kind of general application and personal statement, candidates also had to go through the pre-interview assessment of the art portfolio, a test that was given, the interview itself, and also then the post-interview assessment of the whole process. So one of the candidates that we observed was Nina. This is a pseudonym. Nina is a young Black British woman from a poor inner city area who was applying for a BA in fashion. She met all of the academic assessment criteria, and we observed the assessment of her art portfolio, which was ranked as good. So there were 3 piles. So sort of excellent and poor, and then in the middle was good, and that's where hers fell. And there were, a set of standard questions that were asked, including about what the major influences were. And so she replies that her major influence is hip hop, and she also explains that she would like to design sports tops. We observe the interview panel actually kind of disconnecting from Nina, speeding up the interview, getting it over quite quickly. She was also not given the opportunity to complete the test, and then she's rejected immediately following her interview. Shortly after, a young middle-class white British male cites a range of contemporary artists as his influences, and he is offered a place, despite having significantly poorer qualifications than Nina, including having failed secondary school art. In their post-interview discussion, the assessment panel formally justified their decision in reference to Nina's portfolio, which they later claimed to be ranked as below average. And they also referred to her immaturity due to her desire to stay home while at university. Nina is misrecognized as lacking fashion flair, although in our view, her clothing was almost identical to that worn by many of the white female candidates that were offered places. Nina is also constructed as immature because she wants to study near to home. The white male candidate embodies the values and practices that appear to reflect those of the assessors. He wants to study away from home. He is dressed and speaks in a particular way, and he cites contemporary artists and designers, all of which is viewed by the interview panel as signifying potential. The case of Nina, I argue, demonstrates how the shared values, practices, and knowledge within a community of practice, in this case fashion, can unwittingly work to reproduce class, gendered, and racialized inequalities, misrecognitions, and exclusions in ways that appear to the assessment panel as fair and transparent. Following publication of the Art for a Few project, we disseminated the research widely, holding workshops with those teaching in arts across higher education institutions, both nationally and internationally. This led to one program team in the UK, responsible for one of the most selective fine arts programs in the country, to dig deep into their assumptions and taken for granted practices. Engaging with the research, they looked closely at their admissions, pedagogical and assessment practices, and a new perspective emerged that deeply concerned them. They realized they had no representation from their immediate schools, colleges, and communities in the local area, and the student profile on the program was highly homogeneous, mainly white middle-class students. The program team started to work closely with the widening participation unit, local schools and colleges, and developed regular program team meetings to collectively reform the ways they thought about what counted as potential and capability. Working with the analysis provided by Art for a Few, they developed new frameworks to accommodate diverse artistic expressions that better represented the university's underrepresented local communities. Sustaining this commitment to transformation of the program over time, their student profile dramatically shifted to a highly diverse one with strong representation from the institution's immediate local communities. The curriculum developed organically as new artistic expressions emerged from their now diverse student communities, and these were being recognized, valued, and included. The program team effectively developed what I call a community of praxis, in which they exercised ethical reflexivity through social justice perspectives, bringing new forms of practice to play, and thus transforming the program. Considering the benefits of working with, through, and against communities of practice in which our assessment practices are differently situated, I argue for the value of building and sustaining communities of praxis. In order to generate time and space for creative, collaborative, and innovative development of inclusive assessment, we need to draw from our points of connection, supporting our sense of belonging and purpose. However, in order to extend the sense of belonging in ways that challenge harmful forms of institutionalized misrecognition, we need to attend the politics of difference, perhaps discovering that difference becomes a pedagogical resource for reimagining inclusive assessment, our curriculum, and our pedagogical practices. In resituating assessment through the lens of difference and through building communities of praxis, we might generate new timescapes to create meaningful forms of inclusive assessment. Creating new timescapes through communities of praxis enables us to collectively grapple with the ways that inclusion can so easily slip into being a mechanism of regulation, misrecognition, and the exclusion of difference, coercing students to fit into or conform to the hegemonic ways of being, knowing, and doing. Inclusion, therefore, demands the recognition of difference through ethical reflexivity, rather than the regulation and exclusion of difference, or the pernicious willingness to so-called transform those seen to be different into the preferred ways of being. This is undoubtedly challenging and requires deep work within our communities of praxis, examining the taken for granted ontological and epistemological foundations that underpin assessment frameworks. I suggest that we draw from Paulo Freire's concept of the circle of knowledge to do this deep, reflexive, praxis-oriented work. This might open up time and space for the cyclical and reciprocal reformation of knowledge and knowing. This is a process of bringing together disciplinary knowledge with the heterogeneous knowledge of those groups, communities, and societies that have often been denied representation in developing higher education practices. Drawing from Nancy Fraser, and in my book with Jill Crozier and Laura Maziaszak, we argue that a multidimensional framework for inclusive practice in higher education is required. Fraser argues that social justice requires attention to and the holding together of redistribution, recognition, and representation, with a focus on enabling parity of participation. Understanding these three dimensions of social justice as interwoven is crucial for reconceptualizing inclusion in higher education timescapes and assessment practices, and challenging hegemonic practices and discourses. Fraser argues that social justice requires holding together these dimensions, even when they create tensions, dilemmas, and challenges. Following Fraser, I argue in my book, The Right to Higher Education, that it is crucial to shift attention away from deficit discourses with its problematic focus on the remediation of what individual students are seen to lack, rather than to situate the challenges students face in the context of the multidimensional injustices that students navigate in order that they can access and participate in higher education. And of course, this would include accessing forms of knowledge within the curricula. Participation is more complex than simply overcoming barriers through access to financial and material resources, as important as this is. Misrecognition and misrepresentation deeply undermine parity of participation. Processes of misrecognition are about the institutionally legitimized values and judgments that are imposed on the misrecognized person in ways that effectively exclude them from parity of participation. In order to have parity of participation, a student must have access to the resources and high-quality pedagogical opportunities that enable access to esoteric practices and institutionally legitimized epistemologies. The students must also, though, be recognized and have access to representation as a fully valued member of the community, which means the inclusion of their experiences, knowledge, and ways of knowing. This, I argue, is Paulo Freire's circle of knowledge. This requires valuing different ways of knowing and being and addressing the historical inequalities that have shaped processes of institutional legitimacy. It is also important to capture the affective, emotional, subjective, and lived experiences of misrecognition and misrepresentation that are felt in and through the body as forms of symbolic violence and injury on the self. This often leads to feelings of shame and fear, and is not a matter of lack of confidence, but of sustained experiences of symbolic violence over time. Institutional fields such as schools and higher education are sites in which subjectivity is formed and also personhood is constituted. And recognition is formed through the dual processes of mastery and submission of the discourses at play within a particular field. And assessment plays a formal and critical role in processes of misrecognition. Judith Butler's concept of performativity sheds light on the way that subjectivity is formed not through who we are, but through what we do, through social practices. And the case of Nina's exclusion from fashion is such a powerful example of that. Assessment is a social practice that is entrenched in complex inequalities and reproductive of misrecognition and misrepresentation. To be more specific, that is, the misrecognition of the value of influences such as hip hop and the misrepresentation of the significance of forms of art such as hip hop on contemporary fashion. Success in higher education depends on navigating assessment practices that operate to recognize a student as successful or not. The student must decode often esoteric forms of academic practice that are granted legitimacy through the community of practice in which the assessment is located. Students from socially privileged contexts often have access to a range of resources that enable them to decode how to demonstrate academic capability through assessment. The successful student must first understand, though, how to write, speak, construct an argument, hypothesis, and read, and so forth, in ways that is recognizable as institutionally legitimate forms of practice within a particular community of practice. These academic practices are highly contextual. They require students to develop complex skills of decoding expectations and academic conventions across the different communities of practice in which they are studying. Academic practices, as I said, so for example, being critical or constructing an argument and so on, tend to be misrepresented as neutral, decontextualized sets of technical skills and literacy that can be straightforwardly taught and assessed, and that students from disadvantaged social contexts simply lack. That these academic practices are historically embedded in class, racialized, and gendered ways of doing is erased from view, thus perpetuating exclusive forms of what is named then as inclusion. Success also depends on anticipating and navigating the expectations and timeframes of assessment, which is part of the insidious dynamics in which misrecognition and exclusion plays out. In thinking through the timescapes of assessment and the impact of these on student experience, I will now draw from a body of qualitative research generated by the CE team to further illuminate some of the theoretical points I've made so far. The student accounts are from a qualitative data set developed in CE of student experiences at the University of Newcastle over the past 5 years, and are with students navigating multidimensional inequalities. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Matt Bunn, Associate Professor Steve Threadgold, Dr. Anna Bennett, Dr. Julia Kofi, Dr. Stephanie Hardacre, Jace Blunden, and Justine Grosard for their contribution to this work. The inequalities in managing time emerges repeatedly in the students' accounts. Students navigating complex inequalities have to manage their time tightly, which inevitably forces them to take an instrumental approach to their studies, undermining richer learning experiences. So for example, Thomas explains that I will skip this lecture and do this assessment instead during this time. And Larry says, so instead of study, I spend most of my time doing assignments. Deficit discourses are powerful, and I have argued in much of my work, these are not only about the words we use and even the practices we take up, they are about the discourses we engage in and the very formation of student identity and the recognition or not of capability. Posey is forced into an instrumentalized approach to her studies due to the time structures of assessment, and yet she represents this as a reflection of her deficiency as a person, saying, I mean, I'd probably do a lot better if I was one of those really, really dedicated people. Yet students show their mastery of the discourses of time management. They decide they must prioritize the assignments rather than the broader engagement with the field in order to be successful in their studies. Some of the students point to the need for change in practice, less regular assessments, and more time for student engagement and learning. Daphne suggests the need for more class discussions to have the opportunity to ask questions without, in her words, feeling stupid. The students raise important points about what is and should be prioritized and what is indeed valued. The time structures seem to push students to prioritize assessments, as I've said, and Wilbur explains, if you waited to learn it in class, you'd have left it too late. And you've got this big assignment to do, you don't have time to do. Sometimes I have to prioritize the assessments, and often I don't have time to go back over the material. The students' accounts demonstrate how the wider institutional values and assumptions about the purpose of higher education create the conditions in which an instrumentalized orientation to their study is reinforced. And this might not only go against the values of the students and the priorities they might have started with, but also, I suggest, to many of us engaged in assessment, but also situated in these problematic timescapes. And as Jan MacArthur suggested in her keynote on Thursday, this highlights that simply making adjustments does not enable inclusion. What we require is a social justice transformative approach that opens up debate about the implicit values and priorities being generated within the timescapes and the structures we work and study within, and how we can possibly change those. Students' accounts bring to light the pressures on educators that they may be facing in the translation of what are contradictory commitments to inclusion, student well-being, and equity. So for example, Roseby explains that in relation to her friend, that her friend went and saw the head of the nursing faculty for clinical, and she said, I really want to get my practicals spaced out a bit more. And the head said, we really don't have time for any mental health problems. Tara similarly says that they don't really understand it past the first assessment or whatever. Tara says, I just felt like I couldn't bring it up as another reason because they'd be like, oh, well, you said that before. Like when I tried to apply for adverse circumstances, they'd be like, well, this experience of gendered violence isn't a sufficient reason. However, some students suggested that a break in the hegemonic timescapes, such as that experienced via COVID, shifted this to some extent. Henrietta explains, in her words, after COVID, I found a lot more lecturers showed us students more grace when it came to late assessments or just support in general. They've been really helpful and more encouraging in just telling us to email them. Because in first year, second year, I don't feel like I was encouraged to reach out as much. But now, most definitely, my lecturers have been saying, yep, just message us. Let us know how you're going. Please send us questions because it's our job, which is really refreshing. In the prioritizing of time management and the lack of flexibility with regards to the context of lived experiences, as well as the valuing of deep learning, students face a number of dilemmas that are almost impossible, I suggest, to navigate. Corinne, for example, explains this in relation to the outstanding pedagogical supervision she receives as part of her honors research against the need to be in paid work to support her studies and the demands and expectations of her employer. So she says that one day her employer took me aside and he said, "Your supervisor seems to be ruling your life. You need to tell her to back off and that you're part of the team here and your first priority is your team." And I was kind of like, she doesn't need to back off. So I said, she's doing exactly like talking to the other honors students. She seems like she's the best supervisor you could ever have. So I said, she's fine. And I said, I'm not trying to be rude, but it's actually kind of more like I wish work would back off a little bit because I feel like blah, blah, blah. And he did not like that at all. And my hours got dropped for a while from that. And yeah, I tried to explain to him how important honors was. And he said, well, this store is my career. Is my career not important? And I said, yeah, but I'm just a casual. And he was like, well, you're just a casual. Why do you even need this job? Like, do you want to leave? Blah, blah, blah. So finally, I've argued that resituating assessment through the lens of difference and through building communities of praxis, we might generate new timescapes to consider what inclusive assessment means in the context of our fields and how we might affect social justice transformation. I suggest this requires orientations towards social justice praxis, the bringing together of theoretical insights on the working of knowledge, power, and inequality with our commitments to transformative forms of practice. I have also suggested that moving towards communities of praxis might open up counter-hegemonic timescapes to grapple with the ways that assessment can unwittingly become a mechanism of regulation, misrecognition, and the exclusion of difference. Inclusion is often a mechanism in which students are coerced to fit into or conform to the hegemonic ways of being, knowing, and doing, or to risk exclusion. My position is that striving towards inclusive assessment demands the recognition of difference rather than its regulation and exclusion, presenting us with significant challenges and possibilities to spark our pedagogical imaginations. I recognize that this requires more than the development of communities of praxis, of course. It demands transformation institutionally and even epistemologically and ontologically. And that, of course, is deeply challenging. However, I suggest that forming communities of praxis is a really good starting point to generate timescapes for us to work differently together, and through this collective praxis, to challenge the competitive, individualistic, performative, and instrumentalist discourses, practices, and structures at play. So, in the spirit of cultivating communities of praxis, through this wonderful timescape that CRADLE has opened up, thank you to CRADLE, I'd like us to end by me offering some possible questions that we can take or not take in the next round of our collective considerations. So these questions are, how might we create the time and space to interrogate the values and assumptions about the purposes of higher education and the right to higher education in relation to assessment structures, practices, and inclusion? How might we more clearly articulate and question how we understand potential, capability, and success? And who judges that? How? And with what implications? What might it mean to work with rather than against difference? And how does this translate to assessment practices? What are the opportunities to build our communities of practice and recreate these as communities of praxis? In what ways could these be of value? And how might we cultivate counter-hegemonic timescapes and collectively challenge the hegemonic timescapes of contemporary higher education? What are the possibilities and what are the challenges for this? So thank you so much again to the CRADLE team for inviting me to speak, and thanks all to everyone here who've been listening. I really look forward to being part of an ongoing dialogue and conversation with you. Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you so much, Penny. so much food for thought in terms of complete transformation. And I found myself reflecting on, if assessment is not going to be primarily individualistic and competitive, then I wonder how much role modeling we need to do as academics in changing our own cultures of individualism and competitiveness. But that was just a thought. I might move to the questions, and we do have a few questions on the Q&A, and please, others, feel free to add. I'll start with a question by Margaret, which has gotten the most upvotes. Social justice perspectives take place in what appears to me a global world divided by worldviews, with one perspective not acknowledging the deep problems of misrecognition and exclusion of difference. What role can we have in HE to bring those with deep resistances along with us?
Such a great question, Margaret. I love that question. It's completely at the heart of what I really am committed to myself, and I think what my colleagues in CE are committed to. I believe that higher education has a crucial role to play in this. But of course, this is a huge contradiction all the time, because higher education is being, restructured, and very powerful discourses are coming to play about what its purpose is. And that reflects on, the funding, the resources, and the policy discourses, and the ways that we understand those and engage them in our own personal context, as well as in our communities of practice. So this is deeply challenging. But where we have the capacity to work differently, I think that we need to take up those opportunities. And, together, I think in our own immediate context, we can work collectively to start thinking about how can we, so taking Nancy Fraser's notion of redistribution, one of the things in CE that we try to do quite a lot is, redistribute the amazing resources pedagogically and also, I suppose, materially that are available in the university. And then through that, you utilize that redistribution as a source of recognition of the different knowledges and cultures and values of the communities in which we work. And we try to do that within university as well as externally. So that's an example. So I don't know if I've fully answered that question, but I think that it's just to continue sustaining those commitments and finding ways to do that together and thinking differently about how we can redistribute higher education resources. So it's not just about bringing people in, it's about taking those resources out and thinking about, what they are in terms of those pedagogical resources that we can provide and offer to work with communities.
Thanks, Penny. If I can take Chair's prerogative for a second and pick up on this idea of shared good examples of work. You mentioned that, a lot of universities are engaging with introducing Indigenous ways of knowing, and you said that that's not enough. We need to actually question whiteness as well. Have you seen good examples of how that's being done in order to take, the things that you have to remove in order to put in other things as well?
Well, I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to suggest we do. So I think that there are lots of good examples. There's obviously huge amounts of efforts around this in lots of places. I think part of it is the misrecognition of that work. I think that we all have probably experienced where we put a lot of effort and time and care into that work, and it isn't recognized as valuable necessarily by university powers that be. But it's pushing back on that and raising the visibility. But it's also, I guess, the point of arguing about these new timescapes is to make the time and space to do that. Because I think it's quite an interesting and problematic thing if we find ourselves in university spaces where we don't have the time and space to think critically about our own practices and our own positioning in relationship to some of these deep commitments that are not straightforward at all, and that we really need to put some time and care into.
Thank you for that. So I've got a question here from Dave Bowd, and I guess what he's doing is challenging the notion that by locating assessment as generated in and controlled by communities of praxis, aren't you setting it up as not to change or to change only incrementally? I guess he's saying that in general, communities of practice and potentially communities of praxis are not readily susceptible to external influence. Are there more productive ways of conceptualizing assessment change, perhaps? You know, as you mentioned, hasn't change mostly occurred through external disruption, not deliberation within the group?
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, David. And I think, you know, the example of the one program team who I argue kind of developed this community of praxis rather than a community of practice is that they worked really, you know, really in a really committed and focused way with their local community groups, with the widening participation unit, and with the students themselves. And again, none of this is quick. This is time over time, probably over a 5-year period. I'm talking about the transformation, but it was through the different expressions of art that finally the students were able to bring into that space, that the curriculum changed over time, and then the assessment changed over time, and the way that potential and capability was viewed changed over time within that team. Of course, that needs sustained work, and it's not something you can just do and then take for granted, so you have to keep working on it. But the idea of communities of praxis really is to build in the parity of participation of a number of different participants who otherwise would not be represented in those spaces.
And following on from that, there's a question by Chia, and she's asking about, you know, to be in these spaces that are using praxis and being ethically reflexive is at times uncomfortable, risky, or dangerous. Do you have any advice for creating those spaces that can actually lead to, you know, bravery, courage, a bit more safety for difference and diversity?
Yeah, I think, and that's, you know, I think that's where deep engagement with questioning what our pedagogical practices are and how those relate to assessment, because it may be different in a whole range of different contexts. So, you know, it takes really, I think, really sensitive and careful forms of pedagogical work and building relationships of trust to do that well. And I know how challenging that is in different pedagogical contexts where you're working with a large number of students. So, you know, I think that it really does raise questions about how you do it, when it's safe to do it. And you can never, ever assume that it's going to be safe. So it's about, you know, the ethical reflexivity is about kind of constantly bringing in a politics of reflexivity into your practice, to keep considering how that's affecting yourself, how that's affecting others around you. And, you know, just building that into your practice. So yes, absolutely. I think to do this work well, you have to be very mindful and highly reflexive. And I think that's where doing that collaboratively is so useful, because you really need the support of others around you as a sounding board, to talk things through, to think about your own practices and to challenge each other. And, you know, I think that's where we really need to work together to do this well.
And I'm just reflecting there, Penny. I did a degree in physiotherapy, and I don't know if it's my memory, but the residing memory was that knowledge was black and white. There was evidence and you followed it. And it wasn't until I was out in practice and really struggling with the complexity that I even reflected on why this degree didn't really set me up to practice as a physio. And so to link in, and so there's obviously disciplinary differences in the ways that we tackle epistemologies and ontologies and how fixed they are, and how critical we're socialized into being. So to tie into the next question from Sarah Hyde, how do you balance the need for social inclusion with the need to ensure safe practices and competency development for graduates in more self-regulated professions such as medicine? On the other hand, I see a lot of potential for using more inclusive practices to develop an understanding and demonstration of professionalism, which is still not assessed very well.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things is that there is no kind of, this is the frustrating thing about arguing from the position I'm arguing from. I can't rattle off, well, the way you do that is A, B, and C. So I think what I'm arguing is that this is a constant set of questioning that we do about, okay, how do we balance these things? And, you know, I drew from Paulo Freire's circle of knowledge to try to think through balancing these different kinds of imperatives within the curriculum around, you know, providing epistemic access to the legitimized knowledge as it exists, because students need that. They need that access. They need to learn they need to be able to have access to develop some of the pedagogical skills around writing that's expected. Otherwise, they won't be able to do that because they haven't had the opportunity to develop that, not because they don't have the capability. So those things are really important. But how do we balance that? How do we make sure that we keep in play a space for questioning? What is being excluded through that process? If we spend too much time just trying to get through the curriculum as it is, and then, you know, trying to build, I suppose, build in a one-off to balance that, is that enough? Are there other ways that we can do that? And again, I suggest that the best way to do that is in collaboration, not only with our peers, but also with our students. To be able to, you know, to develop these spaces of questioning together.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that doing it together, because it's so hard to create safe spaces for everyone when we have so much diversity in the room. And I guess when we're all involved in the practice of questioning, then maybe that role modeling and sanctioning of that practice within that community then becomes more legitimate and more likely to engage others.
Yeah, can I just say, I think that one of the issues and problems is the way that we think about teaching and learning tends to be very reductive, and we tend to focus on methods or skills or, you know, techniques and things like that, without thinking about not that those things aren't important. I'm not saying that those things aren't important. We do need to pay attention to them, but within a broader framework that enables us to ask those deeper questions. And I think that that's something that we're being denied a lot of the time because of the intensified timescapes in which we're teaching and developing curriculum and developing assessment. And so there's always this tension between, you know, the structures that we're positioned in and the way that we want to work. But I guess what I'm arguing for is, can we sort of subvert those spaces together to create our own ways of working that builds in this deeper attention to these kinds of questions?
Yeah, I think that'll be something for us at CRADLE to reflect on, how, you know, what are the ways we do that already, and perhaps what are the different ways we could start to do that. This is a bit of a long question, and I'll try and truncate it. Sarah Lambert, if I've garbled your question, please let me know. Sarah's saying that widening participation initiatives have potentially done more damage than good, and we see that in the Nina example. Are we at a point where widening participation needs to be paused to focus on ethical reflexivity of HE staff and management to avoid the kinds of pushbacks we are seeing, example, banning teaching anti-racist strategies?
Yes, absolutely, Sarah, definitely. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm arguing. I think that is so important. And so, you know, this is about communities of praxis, not only in relation to academic staff, but also to all staff, you know, leaders and managers, people who are affecting policy, but also people who are working within widening participation centers. And I think it's absolutely important that people are able to be given in a way, it should be an entitlement that they're given the support to exercise reflexivity about their work, because they're working within a space that is about histories of inequality. And therefore, in order to do that careful work, you need to have the space to be able to think about what it is you're engaging in, and to do that in an ethical way.
Thanks, Penny. You're being grilled, and there's a few more questions to go. Just to note for everyone, we've got another 5 minutes or so. So and you can add a few more questions if you like. So there's a couple of questions here by Amina. They're a bit different in flavour. So I'll start with the first one, which is really important. I feel that many Black scholars feel spoken over and overlooked, like the Nina story in these spaces. So in what ways do you feel more privileged scholars can be in better conversation with and otherwise amplify those whose voices have been overlooked in favour of more palatable voices?
And thank you, Amina. I think that's so important. And I do actually believe that the broader hyper-competitive environment in which we're being forced to work does not help with that. Because, in my view, what we need is collaboration, 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 but collaboration that is a meaningful form of collaboration, not a instrumental form of collaboration, one in which, the collaboration means that we are really thinking very carefully about the politics of representation, and who gets represented and how and in what ways, and how we work together ethically. So, more collaboration through these communities of praxis, in which the knowledges of Black scholars and Black students can be prioritized and privileged in ways that's not patronizing or working on behalf of the career sort of trajectories of people in more powerful positions.
Thanks, Penny. There's a set of questions and comments here from Amina, John, and Sarah, and I'll try and kind of pop them into the one question. So this is more about the methods of learning and teaching, which you touched on in a little while ago. Do you think different assessment types and a range of options could help with more inclusive assessment? Others have suggested perhaps it's more about the framing of these assessment strategies that we use, or perhaps to think about how they are authentic to the discipline.
Yeah, I think both things are important. As I said, I think the framing of it is really important, but I'm a feminist scholar, and so I had the fortune of being educated in a context of feminist methodologies around writing, and I learned a lot about writing differently in that space. And I'm very passionate about that. I do a lot of writing programs with people to think about how different voices can be recognized in those spaces, in the spaces of exclusion of academic writing. But saying that, I think that whenever you move away from some of the conventions, you create new challenges. So, it's not easy to find new ways of doing assessment, and to be clear with the students about what the expectations and the conventions around that might be, or how the judgments are going to be formed. And so you have to put a lot of care and pedagogical time into that process, because otherwise, you leave people in a rather vulnerable position where not only do they have to learn those conventional practices, but they now have to learn these new ones. And maybe it wasn't very clear about what the expectations are, or how they'll be judged around engaging with those. So, I think, again, all of these things take some time to think about very carefully about what are the implications for students engaging with those.
Oh, I like your phrasing there, the undermining and how we're going to judge them. And, you introduce a new task and give it 2 marks, and it just all ends up, the purpose is lost within that for the students who see it as just another hurdle to jump through. Two final questions to close off this session. The first from Lois, who's saying that I really liked how you drew attention to time and the need for time in order for deep learning to occur, and also the importance of recognizing that out-of-study time commitments are not equitable across students. Do you have strategies for thinking about disrupting the traditional 12-week term so that there can be more flexibility for students without removing the human connection?
Yeah, I mean, again, Lois, I don't have absolute answers to that question. I think, you know, my answer would be that I think that from the work that we did in CHE around time, I think what I was really impressed with was the need for both structure and flexibility. You know, where students had a lot of flexibility, it was very hard for them to make sense of what they needed to do and how to engage with the time structures. And where it was overly rigid, there was a very instrumental kind of approach, and people who fell outside of that were excluded. So I think that, you know, what we need is to create structures, but within those structures to actually have forms of flexibility so that we can acknowledge the different kinds of inequalities that students continue to navigate as they go through university. So, I mean, again, that's not an answer, but it's a different way of working, I suppose, in the way that we feel that we can, I suppose, navigate on behalf of students and find solutions to support them through.
Thanks, Penny. And our last question comes from Tan, and she's asking about, she's impressed by your point around embedding embodied values of marginalized students, and the work there is, her work is around international students, and she's wondering whether this links to the concept of agency as far as what, and so the question is, what do you think marginalized international students can or need to do to make this revolution happen?
Well, I mean, I think that international students are also, you know, they're in a different set of dynamics around how they navigate their construction in higher education and who they are pedagogically in terms of the strategies around recruiting international students that sometimes undermine their capacity to fully participate. And that is, I recognize that creates a lot of intensified pedagogical experiences sometimes for both the student and the tutor who is supporting that student. So I think, you know, again, there's no answers to this, but I do actually think that individualism is something that really undermines people's sense of capability, and that by creating spaces in which people can provide peer mentoring as well as, you know, having tutoring structures or student support structures, I think is really important, because as one of the students said in our study, you know, it's about being able to ask questions without feeling stupid. So one of the things in CHE that we do is that we have what we call relational navigators, and those relational navigators create informal pedagogical spaces in the university where people who identify with one another come together informally, and they're able to ask all sorts of questions in that space and answer them for each other, or the relational navigator will help finding the ways to address those questions. And it really helps to provide, that's why I say those informal spaces are just as important as the formal ones. It really helps navigate those formal spaces as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Penny, and thank you to all the participants and your engaging questions. I really love the idea of continuing this symposium with the notion of ethical reflexivity, and hopefully we've created some spaces to dialogue and negotiate and question how we can change inclusive assessment within the academy. So thank you so much for your keynote, and I'll see you hopefully in a little while. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.